At Zen Center of Philadelphia, we've been concentrating on Genjo Koan for a few weeks. And so this is a continuation of that. If you want to hear the first talks, they're on our website. This is actually the third talk, but I discovered when I was preparing my talk for today that I had skipped a little paragraph in there. So I'll have to go back and do that. So this will turn out to be the fourth talk. If you're trying to look it up on our web, we'll call it the fourth talk, Genjo Koan talk. I'm not going to fill you in on Dogen and Genjo Koan. I think you all are quite aware of that. I'm going to read you the parts of Genjo Koan, starting from the beginning, that we've done so far, and then we'll go on to the paragraph we're going to do today. When all dharmas are Buddha dharmas, there are delusion and realization, practice, birth and death, Buddhas and living beings. And when the 10,000 dharmas are without self, there are no delusion, no realization, no Buddhas, no living beings, and no death. The Buddha way transcends being and non-being. Therefore, there are birth and death, delusion and enlightenment, living beings and Buddhas. Nevertheless, flowers fall, though we love them, and weeds grow, though we hate them. To carry the self forward and illuminate the 10,000 things is delusion. When the myriad things come forth and enlighten the self, this is awakening. Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings. Further, there are those who continue realizing beyond realization, and those who are deluded throughout delusion. When Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they do not necessarily notice that they are Buddhas. However, they are actualized Buddhas, and they go on realizing Buddha. So here's today's paragraph. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened by the 10,000 things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So what we're dealing with here is one of the most famous passages that Dogen has ever written. It's frequently quoted, sometimes very glibly. And though we've all heard it quite a few times, do we actually know what it means? He begins to study the Buddha way is to study the self. The first question to ask about this line is, what self is Dogen talking about here? Does he mean big self or little self, as Suzuki Roshi used to put it? Does he mean psychological self or the thinking self? Does he mean everyday self or Buddha nature? Is there more than one self? Is there any self at all? We've talked a lot in various Dharma talks in the past about how each of us enters practice thinking that we exist as a permanent self, a self that has continuity as long as we're alive. Some people even think that this continuity continues after we die. Generally, we think that this self resides somewhere inside of us, and we generally think that it's our thoughts and our emotions. And although we're aware that over years and time we change, still we feel that there's something that endures. And that something is what we call me. That's who answers to our name. Mir. Seeing you. Pat. Lawrence. That's who we think those names that we have are. Not only are we convinced that we have a self, but we're also convinced that this self is set apart from the presumed selves that others have as well. Sometimes this division feels like a great gulf. Other times not so much. On Monday, I had to go to a family funeral in Delaware. I don't see my primary family all that often, and I was certainly aware of the great gulf that I always feel when I see them, kind of the odd man out in my family. In order to feel kin to them, I have to get very broad and just sort of identify with those human things that everybody has just because they're human. All the other stuff is completely different. So, what is Dogen telling us in this line? He's telling us that the first task of our practice is to take a look at this sense of self that we've always taken as self-evident. He wants us to study this self and see if it's what we've always thought it is. His premise is that we've been deceiving ourselves, that we don't really know what the nature of this self is. So we sit zazen. We listen to talks that suggest different ideas about what this self might be or what it might not be. And if we practice long enough and with enough attention, we arrive at Dogen's next line. He says, to study the self is to forget the self. So what is it that happens between our entry into practice with a solid sense of self and to this forgetting of the self? What happens mostly is zazen. In zazen, we learn to be quieter. We have a little less frantic mental activity. We're still aware of our thoughts, but we put less value on them. We learn to shift our attention from our thoughts up here in our heads to our bodies, down to the hara, down to the breath. We learn to shift to the sensations that we experience from moment to moment. The sounds, the smells. We stop prioritizing our thoughts and we're more attentive to what's going on around us. We also begin to differentiate. At first, we seem to have this great flood of thoughts and sensations. You know, William James is called he is actually talking about the mind of a baby when he says this, but he says it's a booming, buzzing confusion. And that's certainly what I saw when I sat down on the Zen cushion for the first time. We begin to perceive some space around these individual moments, some pauses, a little silence. We see that our thoughts and feelings and sensations change second by second. We see that they're just a series of moments in time. They're all a small piece of what we call self. After a while, we begin to see that this self that seems so solid to us is really just a series of momentary experiences. We connect these disconnected moments into what seems like a self by the way we use our minds. We think about it and we construct a self. So if this chatter that goes on in our heads is not us, what is? When we try to study the self and to ask what is this irreducible core that we call us, all we can find is this moment-to-moment experience. And if that moment-to-moment experience is always changing, what does that say about the self? What is there to hold on to as a core, a self, and us? We sense that there's a vast openness, something that's receiving. But this we can't find or see. The self that seems so real to us when we entered practice turns out to be considerably more tenuous than we thought. We begin to see through that solidity of self that we had believed in so firmly. And what we see is no self. We forget the self because we see its fleetingness, its lack of substance. We've seen that we can't grasp, we can't hold on to anything that we can call a self. The interesting thing, though, is that our original way of thinking and feeling about self remains available to us. We don't lose the ability to see things from the point of view of this provisional self. To live in the relative everyday world in which all of us live, a world where others think they have a self, we have to be able to function in this way of being. So we never really entirely get rid of that everyday self. We see through it, but we still have it, such as it is. Dogen often calls this being and non-being. So this being self remains with us. Once we've seen through this self, it's never as real to us as it was in the beginning. And by studying the self, we've accessed an alternative point of view, no self, or as Dogen would say, non-being. So now we have two ways of looking at things, being and non-being, self and no self. The absolute does not negate the relative. The point of view of no self only supplements rather than eliminates the point of view of everyday self. We see through self to know that it isn't what we thought it was, but we retain the ability to function out of ordinary self. This might be reassuring to some of you. Zen students sometimes get a feeling that if they ever see emptiness or no self, that they'll be off in some non-existent black hole somewhere. No, you still keep that other aspect of yourself. To forget the self is to be awakened by the 10,000 things, Dogen says. Dogen is telling us that how the world seems to us once we've seen through the idea that we're a continuous, separate self. How is it once you've seen that, once you forget the self? Instead of being centered in our thoughts and feelings, we strengthen what we've discovered in Zazen. We learn to shift our identification with our thoughts and recenter our attention in our bodies. We notice what's around us from moment to moment. We shift from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. We shift from what's in our heads to the 10,000 things, to the rest of the universe. This shift in how we see the world when we realize no self is illustrated by the net of Indra. The net of Indra pictures a vast net of everything in the whole universe. Before we realize no self, if we had looked at such a schema of what the universe is like, it would have us right in the middle of that net. We'd be like the spider, and everything would be like revolving around us. But once we realize no self, we see each and everything connected in a net of equality. We're just one little point on this net, not special or important in any way. Nothing is more important than anything else. Things cannot be separated. They're an interconnected matrix. What connects them is karma. Why? Each thing is what it is because it's the result of other things, all of which have brought each into being and continues to influence everything else in this net. Each thing becomes the cause of something new. Cause and effect in endless relationship. All these causes and effects and influences are many and they're very complex. They vary in strength and duration. All things are influencing all other things at all times. This is why the world is so complicated and it's hard to tease out the reasons for things sometimes. Because things cannot be separated, we can say that this net is one thing. It's not a collection of separate entities. So this net or web is what we see when the self is awakened by the 10,000 things. We see the 10,000 things rather than the self. Just as the net becomes one whole being, we as part of the web are inseparable from everything in it. When we experience the 10,000 things without an idea of a separate self between us and them, they awaken us. What do we see? What do they awaken us to? Compassion for one, clarity for another. When there's no self to protect, we can feel the suffering of others and reach out to help them. When there's no separate self always standing between us and the rest of the world, we see directly and clearly things as they are, not through a curtain of self. Dogen continues, he says, when actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. He uses this word actualized. To actualize, contains the root act. So actualizing means what you do, what's the result. So what happens when you're awakened by these 10,000 things? He also uses this phrase, he says, body and mind as well as bodies and minds of others drop away. This is a big Dogen phrase. It comes from his enlightenment experience. When Dogen was in China with Ru Jing So the story goes, they were sitting late one night and the guy next to him started to go to sleep in his zazen. And Rujing came around with his slipper and whacked the guy on the head because he was sleeping. And it made a little sharp sound. And Dogen said, aha, eureka, I've got it. So this was his awakening experience. So he's using that same term here, body and mind drop away. Sometimes it's translated fall away. When our practice becomes seeing the myriad things as one with each other, one with us, empty of self, then body and mind drop away. The truth is that as soon as we see that we don't have a permanent separate self, but that we're creatures whose reality is changing every moment, in this very next instant, we see that the rest of the universe is no different from us. It too is empty. All things, like us, are not the same from moment to moment, and thus they have no permanent separate self either. Like us, they exist only as part of a pattern of cause and effect. When we realize this, they awaken us. This is body and mind dropping away. Your body and mind and the body and mind of others. And this happens simultaneously. Your emptiness, the emptiness of others. No self meets no self. Emptiness meets emptiness. Dogen continues, no trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So Dogen has just told us in the last line that the 10,000 things awaken us. But now he's telling us no trace of enlightenment remains. Why does he say this? What's the Dharma logic here? What he's pointing out is that this meeting, when we meet things with no self, we're intimate with them. It means having no separation from them. And when we meet each thing like this, whatever we meet fills the whole universe. That's all there is. No self, no object, just this. There's no room for enlightenment in such a meeting. To bring awakening into it, we would have to be looking from the outside, from a perspective of a self who has gained something called enlightenment. So when we are awakened by the 10,000 things, no trace of enlightenment remains. And he adds, and this no trace continues endlessly. In such a moment of no separation, we're also separated from time. In order to take time into account, we'd have to stand outside the moment and consider its relationship to other moments. That's how in the ordinary world we measure time. It's a sequential thing, a relationship of moments. So this very moment is always outside the measurement of time, and therefore it could be said to be timeless or to continue endlessly. Such a moment is in effect eternal, not a word that Zen uses, but you could say that. Some translations of this particular line add, and this traceless enlightenment continues forever. It's another translation. And this forever is another way of talking about time that can't be measured. I'm going to reread you this passage again, because we're at the end of the passage. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be awakened by the 10,000 things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So we know that in Genjo Koan, Dogen is trying to teach us to be flexible in the point of view from which we see things. Don't get stuck in one way of seeing things. In this Genjo Koan chapter of The Treasury of the True Dharma I, he continually switches from the relative to the absolute, to the transcendence of both relative and absolute. In this particular passage that we looked at today, he's outlining the steps that we need to take in practice to proceed from our original conviction that we have a self to the acknowledgement that from the absolute point of view, we face an empty universe from an empty self. When living out these insights, we become inseparable from everything else, from the 10,000 things. That's what he's outlining for us here. So what would be different in our lives, in how we experience the world, if we see it as Dogen does? What difference does his teaching make? All the difference in the world. We don't feel alienated from a world that is us. We don't feel anxious when we're not separate from a world that we need to protect ourselves from. We can become like Avalokiteshvara with 10,000 ears to hear the cries of the world and 10,000 hands to reach out and help, because we see each and everything and person as ourselves. You know, Dogen is often seen as a very intellectual writer, and so he is. But if we read his teachings rightly, they're also full of heart and passion and poetry, beautiful poetry. So Dogen places studying the self at the heart of practice, the very center. So please use this session to do just that. Study the self. Look closely.